Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take care of drawing the midground and the foreground textures, and because this involves concepts that you've done before, you're going to be challenged to do this in this video. So your first challenge is to load the textures. You're going to create two Texture 2D variables called midground and foreground, and you're going to use load texture to load the textures slash backbuildings.png for the midground and textures slash foreground.png for the foreground. Remember, here's our textures folder. So this is where we're getting backbuildings.png and foreground.png. Don't forget, you need to unload textures at the end of the program. Pause the video and do this now. Now here's the line where we're creating our background variable of type texture2D. We're going to create two more, one for the midground and one for the foreground. So let's create a texture2D called midground, and we'll initialize it using load texture. Now we're going to load textures slash back-buildings.png. Now we also want to create a texture2D called foreground. And for this, we're going to call load texture, and we're going to load textures slash foreground.png. Now we can't forget, we need to scroll all the way to the bottom of our program and unload these textures before we call close window. So let's use unload texture and unload midground, and we'll also call unload texture and unload foreground. So now for your second challenge. We now have texture2D's midground and foreground, and we're going to want to scroll these to the left once we start drawing them to the screen. So we're going to create some float variables for the X position of the midground and foreground textures. Create a float called MGX for the X position of the midground, and a float called FGX for the X position of the foreground. You're going to update these inside the while loop just like we did with our background X position variable BGX. So each frame, subtract a value of 40 times delta time from MGX and subtract a value of 80 times delta time for FGX. And you also need to reset these each to 0 when they're less than or equal to the negative width of their texture times 2. Pause the video and do this now. Now we have our midground and foreground textures. For each of these, we need a float for their X position. So just under midground, I'm going to create a float called MGX. Just under foreground, I'm going to create another float called FGX. Now we need to update these in the while loop. So let's take a look at how we're updating BGX. We're going to do this same thing for MGX and FGX. So for MGX, we're going to use the minus equals operator, only instead of 20, we're going to use 40 times dt, and we need to check with an if statement to see if MGX is less than or equal to the negative value of the midground texture dot width times 2. If MGX is less than or equal to this value, we need to reset it to 0. So we'll say MGX equals 0.0. We can give this its own comment and say scroll the midground. Now we need to update the foreground variable FGX. So we're going to say FGX minus equals, but for FGX, we're going to use 80 times delta time instead of 40. So this texture will scroll a bit faster. Now we do need to check FGX with an if statement to see if it's less than or equal to the negative value of its texture foreground dot width times 2. If it is less than or equal to this value, we need to set FGX back to 0. And for this one, we can give it a comment and say scroll the midground. So now we have 3 variables, one for each texture, and we're updating it each frame. And finally, for your third challenge, you're going to draw the textures for the midground and foreground. You're going to call draw texture X twice for each texture. For each one, you'll need to create the vector2 variables. For the midground, you'll create mg1 pause and mg2 pause. For the foreground, you'll create fg1 pause and fg2 pause. Then you'll draw each texture twice, passing these vectors in for the position of the texture. Scale each texture by 2 by passing in 2.0 for the scale input parameter of draw texture X. Pause the video and do this now. So here are the calls to draw texture X for the background. We're now going to draw the midground and the foreground. For the midground, let's put a comment and say, draw the midground. We're going to create a vector2 called mg1 pause, and this will be the position for the first midground. For the X, we're going to use mgx, and for the Y, we'll use 0.0. And now we can draw the texture by calling draw texture X. The first parameter is going to be the texture for the midground, which is called midground. Next is the position, and we're going to use mg1 pause. For the rotation, we're going to use 0, and for the scale, we're going to use 2.0. The color can simply be white. Now that's the first call to draw texture X, but we're drawing this twice, so we'll need another vector2, and we're going to call this mg2 pause. Now for the X, we're going to use mgx, but we need to add a value to this, and that value is the midground texture's width times 2. So we're going to add midground.width times 2. And for the Y, we're simply going to use 0.0. And now we can call draw texture X for the second midground texture. For the texture 2D, we're passing in midground again. For the position, we're using mg2 pause. For the rotation, we're passing in 0. And for the scale, we're passing in 2. And our color will be white. And finally, we need to draw the foreground. So we'll add one more comment that says draw the foreground. Now for the foreground, we need a vector2, and we'll call this fg1 pause, and we'll initialize it with fgx and 0. And we can now call draw texture X. For the texture, we're going to pass in foreground. And for the position, we'll use fg1 pause. The rotation will be 0, the scale will be 2, and the color will be white. Now we're going to draw this twice, so we need another vector2, and this one will be called fg2 pause. Now for the X, we're going to use fgx, but we need to add the width of the foreground texture times 2. So we're adding foreground.width times 2, and the Y will be 0. Now we can call draw texture X, passing in foreground for the texture, fg2 pause for the position, 0 for the rotation, 2 for the scale, and white for the color. Excellent job! Now we can go ahead and hit run and start debugging and see our scrolling backgrounds. And here we have it. We have our background scrolling by slowly, the midground scrolling by a little faster, and the foreground scrolling by the quickest of all. So in summary, we drew the midground and foreground textures, and we created X position float values so we could scroll these textures to the left. We created position vectors using our X position float values, and we drew each texture twice so that we got continuous scrolling. Great job! The game is starting to come together. We're now ready to wrap this up by implementing winning and losing conditions in the videos to come. I'll see you soon.